Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 8, Halacha 3. If you're following along in the art scroll, we're on 63a1. Today, we're going to be covering things that are d'Rabbanan about selling Sheviis produce. Now, keep in mind, we covered this before. You're not allowed to do Sheviis selling where you're getting a large quantity and you're selling it for profit. You're not allowed to make yourself look like a retailer, make yourself look like a merchant. And one of the other things about it is, let's say, now, yeah, you have some sales for Sheviis produce, but there's a lot of asterisks on this kind of sale, okay? Let's say you have a case where your neighbor needs some oil for Shabbos, okay? And they want to buy some oil for Shabbos, okay? Fine. You can sell them some Sheviis oil for Shabbos. It's a one-off sale. It's not like you're doing business with it. And you're still getting compensated for it. Your household's getting compensated for it. So the money that's going to get exchanged for that sale, that's going to have Sheviis sanctity, but you can do that transaction. You're allowed to do that. There's other cases. What happens if you go and you pick some vegetables and you have enough for now, but you picked a few too many. I mean, not a lot too many, but a few too many. Well, you're not allowed to waste Sheviis produce, and you're not allowed to let it sit and decay. So, okay, so now you go out and you sell a couple of bushels of something or a small quantity of it so it doesn't go to waste. Of course, the money that you're going to be getting for it is going to have Sheviis sanctity. And in a way, by doing this sale, you're helping to make sure that the Sheviis produce doesn't get wasted. Now, you could have a case where, okay, perhaps, you're doing a small amount of this even to help with your food needs. In other words, let's say you have Sheviis cucumbers and you're selling a few extra Sheviis cucumbers that you have. You have some that you were going to use for pickles and you're going to use for salads, and you have a few left over and they go bad pretty quickly. You want to make sure they're not wasted, and you want to take the extra sales on those pickles, and it's only a few pickles, and you're not setting up as a merchant. And now you're going to take this money and you're going to use it for your food needs. You're going to use it to increase the food security in your house. You're going to take it. You're going to buy grain that you can grind to bread, and it's actually like a case where you're pretty poor. You have a lot of time on your hand where you can actually go to the market and sell a few pickles, right? Instead of like doing your main job. Like, this is kind of what you're doing. I mean, this is really kind of like at the lower end of the economic strata. But nonetheless, this is going to be allowed. We are worried about things that are going to look like being a retailer, things where you're selling a large quantity of product for profit. We talked about this before. Even going to the same place over and over and over again to sell is going to be a problem. So what we're going to be covering here today is going to be a case where, and again, this is d'Rabbanan, where we're selling it in a way where it's normally sold during the year, okay? During the other years. So let's say you're taking fig cakes, okay? The way you sell dried figs is normally with fig cakes. So if you had fig cakes and they were going to be Sheviis, you really wouldn't be able to go to the market and sell them in the same packaging, in the same way that it's processed as fig cakes. You'd have to do something else. Let's say you had Hisav, which is readily available in Jerusalem forest, and it's very good on eggs. And you picked some and you want to sell it as a spice and buy bread with it or something like that. And normally the way it's done is they're going to tie it up in a bushel, and you're gonna maybe put some paper around it, and then you can kind of crinkle the paper, and a lot of these leaves, these little tiny leaves, will fall out, and you can gauge it so that you don't have too much or too little. In other words, you don't overspice your eggs in the morning. So it's going to be tied up in a bushel. All right. Well, that's the normal way of sale. Well, you're not going to be able to do that in Sheviis because, again, it's going to look like and again, this is D'Rabbanan, but it's going to look like you're doing it for a regular year, a regular sale, and the rabbis are putting a restriction on it. So let's get into this Mishnah, talk about the details of this law. The Mishnah says, one may not sell Sheviis produce by measure, nor by weight, nor by number. So what is that going to mean? Now, normally when you go and you buy regular produce, you're either buying X number of fig cakes, or you're buying it by weight. In other words, you're weighing out the cucumbers and you're buying it by how much it is, or you're maybe doing it by measure. Sometimes, people will say like, buy 3, and here's the price for buying 3. So any way that is going to be done with these measurements, this is going to be problematic. So they're going to put that restriction. Why is that? Why are they doing this? What they're trying to do is they're trying to do it by estimate. They want you to be doing it by estimate because what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure there's really no profit in there for you. Okay, they're really making pressure on the profit. Okay, and the idea of putting pressure on the profit is it's going to de-incentivize people, and it's going to de-incentivize particularly the cheaters from coming and dealing in this merchandise. Now, there were a lot of cheaters, and this is one of the reasons why Am Yisrael got exiled. Particularly, by the way, there's a Gemara somewhere in the Shas, in the Yerushalmi, that particularly because Sheviis and Meiser Sheni wasn't kept right, they were sent out to Syria in exile. So measure for measure, Hashem is basically saying in a midrash that parallels this Gemara that, because you don't want to keep the laws of the land, I'm going to send you out of the land so you don't need to keep the laws of the land. So the idea here is that it's trying to make it by estimate, and when it's sold by rough estimate and it's not in exact measurements, then it's going to be hard to gauge the exact value on it, and it's going to put pressure on the total sale price, which is going to lower profit. And again, if you're selling things by weight, or by the way, figs were normally sold by weight, and bunches of vegetables. So let's say when you go into the green store today, they'll package up the lettuce, and inside, you can buy a package of this, lettuce, and it's based on, the total sale price is like 3 bunches for 10 shekels. So that's another way to do it. Also for heads of cabbage can be like that. I've seen that in the vegetable store. So the idea is that the produce has to be sold by rough estimate. So the Mishnah is going to continue, and it's going to say, and one may not sell figs by number, nor vegetables by weight nor number. Again, these are normal ways of transacting it. Figs are normally sold by weight. And the Mishnah is going to continue, and Bet Shammai says also, one may not sell vegetables in tied bunches. So Bet Shammai is making a strict prohibition selling vegetables in tied bunches. So even if you have a number of bunches and it would be estimated, but it's tied in bunches, it would be problematic, right? So Bet Shammai is only going to set it up where you can buy loose vegetables. Why? Because normally it's sold in bunches during the year, and they want to, again, put that pressure on the seller so that the volume of business they're going to be able to do on it is very small, and also there won't be a lot of profit in it. So Bet Shammai is not considering an estimation to be a big enough reason to permit the sale. And the idea is that since vegetables tied in bunches is a normal way to do it, they don't want you to do it that way. They want it to be sold individually. Bet Hillel says produce that is customarily tied in bunches in the home for domestic consumption may be tied in bunches for sale in the market. And this applies, for example, to leeks and milky blossoms. So sometimes you'll go into a house and you'll see garlic is braided up, and they'll hang the garlic. Also, chili peppers, the hot chili peppers can be done this way as well, and they'll dry out. And then as you're cooking, you just sort of, grab off a couple of cloves of garlic, or you grab off a couple of cloves of, or a couple of chili peppers, and you chop it up and you put it into your eggs in the morning. Now, if it dries out a little bit, that's fine, no harm done. I mean, garlic, as long as it's in its peel, will be good for a long time. And same with chili pepper. If it dries out, it's going to basically last forever. So a lot of times in your house, to store it, it will be tied and hung. And also with leeks, you can take these leaves that go brown. You might not want the leaves anyway, although the leaves are very good for making soups and stocks. But generally speaking, where you're seeing it braided up, they'll let the leaves go brown. They'll tie it up, and because you really are desiring the bulb. And then you just hang it in storage. And when you need a bulb, you cut off from the dead leaves, you cut off the bulb and you start to process it. So the idea of Bet Hillel is saying, wait a second. If you're normally going and braiding this garlic, because that's the normal way that it's presented in a home, and you have a few extra braids of garlic that you want to go take out to the market to sell, you have a little bit extra. Well, since you'd be storing it that way in your house anyway, and you'd be using it in your house anyway, you can take it out to the market. That's going to be the idea of Bet Hillel. In other words, you have a private house, and it's normal that they're going to tie it this way. They're normally going to be tied, for particularly these vegetables in these kinds of bunches. And the idea partially is so that you can easily get at it, and you can easily see how much you're going to need per week. And since bunching these vegetables is not going to be like a normal commercial use, because again, this is how you're doing it in the house, Bet Hillel is permitting them to be sold in bunches this way. But the prohibition, and Bet Hillel is also going to prohibit it. It's going to be, and again, also Bet Hillel is going to prohibit this. They're going to prohibit it when it's bunched, and that's done exclusively for commercial use. Okay, so if you're braiding up the leeks in a way that's done in a house, but not really for commercial sale, or you're braiding up the garlics, or you're braiding up the chili pepper, and you're hanging them in a way that's not really normally the way you sell chili pepper in a shuk, but it is normal to see it in a house. I've seen it in a house, and I've seen garlic hung like that in a house, but I've never really bought garlic in a shuk like that. So the idea is that if you're having produce that is bunched together commercially in a commercially normative way, Bet Hillel is going to agree and not allow it. They're going to also say, no, it probably has to be done individually. But what they are allowing, which Bet Shammai is not allowing, is they're allowing it that if you have this other way of tying it up, that they're going to say you can take it. Why? Because it's not a commercially normal way to do it in the other years. The Gemara is going to start to talk about this ruling that one may not sell Sheviis produce by measure, weight, or number. And by the way, when we get into separation for tithes out in the field, the proper way for doing that is also going to be for estimation. It's not going to be that you're also going to separate it out by estimation. So we have over here that if you're selling some of the Sheviis produce, this again is the Rabbanan, by measure, it's going to be by you're not supposed to do it by weight or number. It's also supposed to be done by estimate. And the Gemara says, why may one not sell Sheviis produce by measure, weight, or number? And basically, it is in order that people should not sell the produce at a reduced price. So again, this is a rabbinic enactment, and the Rosh says about this that buyers, in order to ensure that they get their money's worth, will not pay full price when buying by estimation. And this method, therefore, guarantees that the Sheviis produce will be sold at a bargain price. And the point of having, says the Rosh Cirilio, the point of having Sheviis produce sold at a reduced price is to highlight the ownerless origin and demonstrate that it is not being used in a normal commercial manner. And one who invested time, money, and effort in a product that tends to sell at the highest possible price, and they're going to spend time on that because they can get the highest possible price, but someone who's allowed to get produce that's hefker without a lot of investment or effort, they want to make sure that that's really kind of being sold at a lower than market price. So the Gemara is going to wonder why the rabbis used this method to try to sell at a reduced price. Why are they trying to put economic pressure on the sale? And the Gemara says, but let the sellers be allowed to weigh against a litra as usual, or to sell by measure or number, and let them be required by rabbinic decree simply to sell at a reduced price. In other words, why are you changing the way the transaction happens? Why, in the other 6 years they can measure by weight. Why not let them do it by weight here as well, but just say you have to knock off, 20% of what you would normally do on a sale? Why are you limiting the measure of how things are done? Now keep in mind, and it's very beautiful, we have to always guarantee accurate weights and measures. And the rabbis are coming along and saying, no, over here, you can't have accurate weights and measures for this, and you got to do it by estimate. And they're really trying to understand, how come? Why? Why can't you use measures, and why can't you just adjust the price and leave the measures alone? And the Gemara is going to answer that. It's going to say, if you were to say this and be lenient with regards to this way of sale, in other words, where you would allow them to sell in a normally commercial way, in a commercially normal way that would be like the other 6 years, like by measuring by weight or by bunches or something like that. The Gemara says, then the seller will also be lax and not treat the produce in accordance with his Sheviis sanctity. In other words, by forcing him to sell it in a different way than usual, you're going to cause him to recognize the sanctity and treat it accordingly. So I want to go over some of the commentary here by the Rosh. So the Rosh is saying that the objective of demonstrating the non-commercial nature of the produce could have been achieved by simply decreeing that it be sold at a reduced price. For instance, let's say, okay, the Sheviis produce in this non-commercial way has to be sold at a 20% discount, let's just say. But the rabbis were trying to guarantee that people would treat the produce with the rules of Sheviis sanctity as well. So, in order to get both objectives, says the Rosh, they decreed that the sale is going to be done only by estimate, not in the usual manner. And how is the usual manner normally done? It's going to be, by measure, weight, or number. And this is going to promote a reduction in price, but also a respectful attitude toward the produce itself. The Sefer Ner is saying that alternatively, the objective is that only a below market sale, and if the rabbis had decreed this outright, it would have caused people to end up denigrating the Sheviis produce. In other words, if they said, no, you have to knock 20% off this Sheviis produce. Well, what would have happened is people would have sat there and said, whatever, I'm just not going to treat it with respect. And it would have caused people to treat the Sheviis produce badly. So the Sefer Ner is saying that in order to achieve the low prices without denigrating the sanctity of the produce and to make sure that the people had respect for the produce and treated it with care, that they're decreeing that the sale be made by estimate. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about a brisa that's going to expand on the parameters of the requirement to sell Sheviis produce by estimation. And it was taught in a brisa. This is going to be, by the way, in the Tosefta 4:11, if you're interested. It says, produce of outside of the land of Israel that entered into the land during Sheviis should not be sold by measure, nor by weight, nor by number, but only by estimation, like the Sheviis produce of the land. I want to jump to what the Chazan Ish says about this in his commentary in his Beur 14:12. And the Chazan Ish says about this that this is only in a case, this Tosefta is only talking about a case where we find that the rabbis treated produce from outside of the land like Sheviis produce in the land. So, there's some hints as to why they were going to be stringent, specifically with regards to the law of selling by estimation. And, the Chazan Ish further says about this that, this is going to be talking about, produce. It's going to be hinting at produce that's going to be recognizable as, or not recognizable as being differentiated from produce from within the land. So if you have a case where you have seventh year leeks, and these seventh year leeks are from outside the land, and they look exactly like the seventh year leeks from within the land. The seventh year leeks from within the land have Sheviis sanctity. The seventh year leeks from outside the land do not have Sheviis sanctity. However, they're going to say, according to the Tosefta, that you should not be selling this by measure nor weight by number, because it's gonna look exactly like it. You're not going to be able to differentiate between the Sheviis produce and not. So the Gemara is going to clarify this a little bit more and hone this a little bit more. And it's going to say, but if the imported product is distinguishable from the product of the land of Israel, it is permitted to sell by measure, weight, or number. In other words, says the Chazan Ish about this, if the product is something that does not grow in Eretz Yisrael, or it's a different variety, or it's easily to distinguish that it's from another area. For instance, they had dates back in that time that were bigger than in Eretz Yisrael. The Bavli dates were much bigger than the dates in Eretz Yisrael. That's easy to distinguish between a date from Bavel and a date from Eretz Yisrael because it's a different variety. The idea is that over there on something that's clearly grown from outside of the land, you don't need to sell it by estimation. But something that you can't tell the difference between, because a leek from the other side of the Jordan and from over here will basically look the same. And so this Tosefta is talking about, and this brisa is talking about something where you can't tell the difference. So the idea is that, since there's no concern that people will mistake this for actual Sheviis produce, they're going to allow you to sell this easily identifiable produce from outside of the land by measure, weight, or number. Now, the Gemara is going to give an example of this application. Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Bun, says in this Gemara, the permit applies to these Kurdekians who came up to the land of Israel, and they sell their produce that they bring from Susisa, which is outside of the land, to the markets of Tiberias. So, since the produce is recognizable, what this is really hinting at, since this is recognizable as produce from outside of the land, these are people, these Kurdekians are living outside of the land, and they are growing it in a place called Susisa. By the way, we covered this in chapter 6, Halacha 1, and this is noted in there as being outside of the land. And the Pnei Moshe, by the way, is saying like this. He's interpreting this as Kurdian wheat, which is going to be a type of wheat that's mentioned in Bavli Sachim 7a, and this wheat was brought up from Susisa and sold in Tiberias. Kurdekians, these might be modern Kurd people, and some of the modern Kurd people live around the very, very north part of Syria, and also in parts of Turkey, as well as in Iraq. They're very famous in Iraq, but it's a pretty large group of people. And by the way, they were generally always friendly to the Jews, unlike the Arabs. Anyway, so these people, perhaps they were living in the northern part of Syria, and they were growing a product like this wheat, and then they were bringing it down for sale down here. And the idea is that this would be recognizable. By the way, these people might not have even been Jewish. So the Gemara is going to expand on this prohibition of selling Sheviis produce by measure. And Rabbi Hiskiah says in the name of Rabbi Abba Bar Mamal, regarding a seller who normally measures out produce in an ordinary basket. So now you're selling things by container, or you're selling things by flask. The Gemara is going to continue because this is not talking about something for measuring, and the Gemara is going to say, but the precise measure of the basket has become confirmed to him through having been used for it 2 or 3 times. So what this is trying to say is, perhaps somebody is coming and selling a, you have a giant barrel of olives, and you have a basket that, strains out the olives, and you can take a basket of olives. And now you have a set price for a basket of these olives. This, by the way, is normal when you go to Osh or Odd or some other place that will sell olives. They'll basically give you a little bucket or a little plastic container, and they'll say, here, fill it up and just pay by container. So the Gemara is going to say, but the precise measure of the basket has become confirmed to him through having used it 2 or 3 times, and he's forbidden to measure Sheviis produce with it. So although the basket that's being talked about here, says Rosh Shirilio, is not designed to be a measuring basket or vessel. So in other words, he's not using it as a weight or something like that. It's basically a way to sell it by measure. And since the owner already knows how much can fit into this basket, he knows how much to charge for it. And basically, once this is done regularly, like 2 or 3 times, you're not allowed to do this. Okay? So if it becomes like an Osh or Odd, like a normal way where, okay, take this, round plastic container, fill it up with olives, and pay me 10 shekels. And if you get a little less or you get a little bit more and you're squeezing it and it's kind of bulging, it's still 10 shekels, right? But that's a normal business thing that they're doing day to day, year to year. Now, if you were doing this as a one-off thing where they said, yeah, just take, you're my neighbor and you need some olives, that's fine. Here, just, take this basket and scoop out some and take it and just pay me, 10 shekels for it, fine, right? But once it becomes a commercially done way where in my shop, this is how I'm selling it, it's buy this basket, take the basket and scoop it and pay me, 10 shekels for what you scoop out of it, that becomes a precise measure. And you're not allowed to measure like that. So you're not allowed to use it now for Sheviis produce, because really it's kind of like a measure, and really selling this measure as a basketful. You're saying, oh, take a basket full of olives. Now, there's a similar ruling, and Rabbi Hoshaya says it is prohibited for a buyer of Sheviis to say to the seller, use your fingers to measure. Now, the Mara Fulda says about this that some people can measure with their fingers how much a vessel is going to contain, and it is forbidden for the buyer to tell the seller to use this way of measuring in order to come up with the amount of Sheviis produce that he's going to sell him. So the idea is that, it's forbidden to measure Sheviis produce with someone's finger. And by the way, this is going to tie into Halacha 4, which is going to have some of the most subtle laws in Halacha coming up tomorrow. But anyway, so this is a particularly interesting one. So let's say somebody has Sheviis wine, okay, and it's nice Sheviis wine. You could say, take your hand and pour out a glass of wine and buy it. So if you take your hand and basically you're making a tefach, right? The width of your hand is going to be a tefach. So you're basically, these are measurings that are used all over the place in Jewish law. So if you're basically saying take 3 fingers, which is going to be one measure in Jewish law, or the width of your hand and pour out a glass of wine and buy it, now you've effectively created a measure for Sheviis produce. And I've seen in bars where, they'll take 3 fingers, hold it up to the glass and pour out your shot or your whiskey or your bourbon or whatever. And it's a way to measure something. And it's going to be pretty close depending on the person. As long as everybody's kind of a normal height, it's going to be pretty close. I mean, if you're talking about a giant basketball player, maybe instead of 3 fingers, it'll be 2 fingers. But it's going to be pretty close. Now, this is where Hoshaya is also pointing out that the seller is asking the buyer to use something as the measure. So in the other cases, it was the seller who had the measure. This is saying to the Torah scholar, that's us, saying, hey, even if the seller is saying to the buyer, use your own measurement tools, you can't do it. Now the Mishnah is going to talk about Bet Hillel and produce that was customarily tied up in bunches in the home. And that's going to be for domestic consumption. And in this case, it can be tied up in bunches for sale in the market. Again, the caveat that you got to keep in mind here is that Bet Hillel has a problem with tying things up in a commercial way and bringing it to the market. But if there's something that's done in a domestic way, but not done in a commercial way for sales, this is what's going to be allowed. For instance, this kind of garlic that, you can kind of hang near your window or stove and just sort of grab off cloves as you go. And it's a good way to keep it dry and cool and in storage, but you don't really buy garlic that way in the shuk. So the Gemara is going to talk about this question dealing with Bet Hillel, and the Gemara is going to take a little bit different angle. It's going to say, regarding a butcher who is a Goan, and he happened to receive a blemish bechor, and that's going to be something where he is allowed to sell it. So, you are prohibited to do business with bechorot, all right? But a Goan who gets a blemish bechor from an Israelite as a gift, okay, he's allowed to sell it. And the idea is that a blemish bechor is going to be permitted for everyone to eat it. Okay, again, this only works if the butcher is a Goan, all right? And this only works if it's a Yisrael selling it, and it only works if this bechor is blemished, okay? So the Gemara is going to continue and it's going to ask, what is the law as to whether he may cut this into slices at home and sell it in the marketplace? Now, in the Bavli, it's going to be talking about where you have a sale of a bechor and it's going to be allowed, but somebody is not allowed to sell the meat in the market or weigh it out on a scale in a normal way. And the Rosh Cirilio says about this that this is because selling the meat of a Bechor in the way of ordinary merchandise is demeaning to the sanctity. So over here and over there, you have a connection where they want to make sure that there's extra care where the merchandise is being treated, because it has sanctity, it's being treated in a respectful way. And so that's part of this restriction that's d'Rabbanan that was put in by estimation. They were afraid that if they said, oh, just knock 20% off and weigh it out as normal, don't worry about estimation, that people would come to disrespect the produce. So the Vilna Goan says about this, in the case of the Bechor, the meat, as in the case of the Sheviis produce, and the basis for the permit is that the product does not have a distinct commercial character. And since butchers would sell meat in butchered slices even from their house, it's going to be permitted with a Bechor, and selling it in butchered slices in the marketplace does not give the sale this commercial aspect. So it's interesting that the Gemara over here is tying into the Gemara over there in Bechorot. You can see more about this in Bechorot in 5.1. By the way, you can find that in 31a in the Bavli. But what's interesting about it is that over here and over there, they're both worried about doing business with this in a non-commercial way. Okay, and it's connected. So, they were only limiting things over here with Sheviis produce to make sure it's not in a commercial way. And over there, they're also trying to do the same thing with the Bechorot. So the question is, what happens with this? Now, the Vilna Gaon is going to say that this Gemara is asking whether it is allowed for the butcher who received this blemished Bechor to butcher the meat in regular slices at his house, just like he would if he was doing ordinary meat in his butcher shop. And really what this is asking, says the Vilna Gaon, is this Gemara is asking, is the butcher allowed to get this blemished Bechor, butcher the meat in the normal way in his house, okay, not in an abnormal way in his house, but in the normal way. So we were covering before in Bechorot, what happens if you are doing it in your house and you're butchering it in an abnormal way and then you're selling the meat. That's going to be allowed. This is slightly different, the Vilna Gaon points out. Vilna Gaon's pointing out, saying, no. You've taken this to your house and you butchered it the same way you would do it in the butcher shop, and now you're bringing it to the butcher shop. What's going to be the law? And you've taken it out to the market for sale. And Vilna Gaon says, this question is whether the prohibition on selling the meat of a Bechor at the market is going to pertain even when it is sold by a butcher in the way of meat to be sold that he butchers in a home. So the Gemara is going to come up with a resolution, and Rabbi Yerushalmi thought to say that it is allowed, and there's support from the following law that we learned in this Mishnah. Rabbi Hillel says in this Gemara, produce that is customarily tied in bunches in the home for domestic consumption may be tied in bunches for sale in the market. So what Rabbi Yerushalmi is trying to do about this sale of of this Cohen butcher and how you're treating the meat, what he's trying to connect between this and that, he's trying to say that just as with Sheviis produce, that selling at the market is allowed when the way of the product is typical of that which is done at the home, so too regarding the meat of the Bechor. So as long as the butcher cuts it as he does at home, he may sell it in the market. So I want to go back to the Vilna Gaon's comment on this. Okay, so in the case of the Bechor, in this case, he's trying to argue, Rabbi Yerushalmi is trying to argue that this case of the Bechor meat is the same as Sheviis produce, and this permit is going to be based on that the product does not have a distinct commercial character. And since butchers would sell the meat in butchered slices even from their house, which is permitted with the Bechor, selling it in butchered slices in the market does not give the sale a commercial aspect. So what we're seeing here is and again, this is really the question, is it allowed for a butcher who received this blemished Bechor to butcher the meat into regular slices at his home, just like he would do for normal meat, and then take it out for sale? And over here, you got this garlic, and you're tying it up for storage, and now you're taking it out for sale in the market. And the idea is that, my neighbor might need some garlic, come over and buy it right from my house. And I have this blemished Bechor that I butchered in my house, and I made it for sale in slices. And my neighbor might also need some meat. He might buy the meat as well from my house, not from it's a one-off sale. And it's not really being done at the market. But Rabbi Yirmiya's suggestion here is rejected. Rabbi Manna says to the contrary. The whole essence of this Mishnah says, in effect, that it is prohibited for the butcher to sell butchered slices so that he should not be perceived as one who is doing business with the Bechor. So let's explain this. So the Vilna Goan says about this that Bet Hillel is allowing the sale of bunched vegetables in the market only when they are customarily made into bunches in the house for non-commercial purposes. Okay, Bet Hillel does not allow the sale of bunched up vegetables that's done normally for 6 years in these sorts of bunches. It's only for something that's only done in the house. Okay, so you can imagine these braided garlics are only stored in a house. You might braid it this way for long-term storage, and it's really just a domestic thing. If you had a way of connecting the garlic together for sale in the shuk, Bet Hillel would not allow that. It's only things that have a domestic nature. The Vilna Gaon says, in this case, even when the butcher cuts the meat into slices in his house, he's still doing it for a commercial purpose. And the idea is that since he can still sell the meat from his house. And the selling of the Bechor meat into butchered slices does give the sale a commercial aspect. And that's why it's going to be prohibited. In fact, says the Vilna Gaon, a butcher is prohibited to sell the meat of a Bechor even from his home. And for a butcher's home is tantamount to a market. So the idea is that it's normal for people to know where the butcher is, and it's normal for people to know that he has meat and to go over there and buy it for him. That's what the Vilna Gaon is pointing out. And so if he gets a Bechor, and if he butchers it at the house, just like he would do in his normal shuk stand, and he has it there available, and everybody knows that you can go to his house and pick it up and purchase it, really, this is a commercial thing. And over here and over there is really going to be the same. In other words, in the case of the garlic that's being tied up, this is really only being done for domestic use and storage. Okay, this is not done for commercial sale. The Vilna Gaon is trying to point out that no, this is a case where the butcher's house is like the marketplace itself. And because of that, there really is a difference between this garlic that's tied up, and it might even be sold from the house over there to his neighbor, and the butcher who has this Bechor that is sliced up and cut up and sold for meat. I want to point out what the Pnei Moshe says about this, and he has a little bit different explanation than the Vilna Gaon. Pnei Moshe says about this that Rabbi Manna means to explain that Bet Hillel's permit obtains only when the vegetables are bunched differently at home than in the market, such that they have a distinct non-commercial character to it. But butchers, on the other hand, cut meat at home in the same way as when they cut it for sale in the market. And since the cut of meat of the Bechor is not distinguishable for the normally commercially sold meat, it may not be sold at the market. So if you had somebody that were cutting things up in a non-commercial way, I suppose it would be allowed. But again, the muscles on a cow is very particular. And if you don't cut it right, you're going to end up with pieces that are not really usable right, because some of the muscles, which can be very close to each other, some might be very tender and for cooking in one way, like grilling, and others can only be cooked in a very long, slow way to break down the tissue. Otherwise, it's inedible if you grill it. There are a lot of cuts of meat that if you tried to grill it needed, it would be inedible. It would be too tough. So really, the butcher is going to know the difference between, because he's a professional, he's going to know the difference between on how to cut it to make sure it's usable. So you're not really going to get a case where the butcher is going to cut it differently in his house. And so really the Pnei Moshe's idea is that no matter what, the butcher is going to know how to do it so that even if he did it in his house or he brought it to the market, it would be, you wouldn't be able to distinguish which is which. But a person who's storing garlic in his house is not a professional, and he's just tying it together. And there's not really like a craft or an art to it. So in this kind of way, it lacks that sort of professional character where, you can distinguish that this is a non-commercial product, whereas with the butcher, it's always going to look like that commercial product. Now, we're going to get into Halacha 4 tomorrow, and it's really going to be getting into some of the most subtle halachot in all of the Shas. We have a couple of very famous ones coming up, and these are some of the most obscure and subtle halachot that we find in all of the Shas's. Very excited about it. Have a great day.